Hey traders, welcome to today's weekly game plan. Starting with economic calendar, some interesting things coming out of China and the US this week. We have retail sales as well as inflation data and some trade balance slash import export data coming out of China, which could be a really good indication for us as to whether we are starting to see that economic slowdown that we believe is here, or that may be a little bit delayed. If we are going to see that economic slowdown, with some of those clues coming out of China, with the Evergrande situation, with some of the debt defaults occurring there across the board in that construction sector, and potentially that spilling over into the manufacturing sector, which has a little bit more debt than the real estate sector, then we might start to see that economic slowdown that we are speaking of, and that may come. And if that is the case, we believe that should be a big deflationary shock to the global economy, and that's going to send the dollar higher and going to send commodity prices back down to 2011 levels and probably beyond that over the next year or two. So we'll be watching for that pretty closely and looking for clues there. Other than that, let's take a look at the charts and see what's on the cards. So starting with the DXY, as we mentioned, there's still that possibility that this week we see a little bit of dollar weakness heading down towards the 92 handle on the DXY before an acceleration of that to the upside coming out of a pretty nice looking ABC corrective structure. We've seen a little bit of a rally in the dollar this morning. There's still the possibility that this goes a little bit higher, kind of up towards the 95 handle and then pulls back from there. It appears like that's what it wants to do, given this morning's little bounce. But when we look at the US dollar, as in the Dow Jones FXM dollar index, which is more equally weighted against the euro or against the dollar, where the DXY is very euro based, we can see that we've had quite a strong move off the highs. We go all the way into the hourly. We had a really strong acceleration of the highs, and this looks more corrective to me for continuation to the downside. So we can see how when we zoom out, coming out of that rally, or of that big acceleration of the highs, going into a correction, we might be here for maybe towards the end of the week, and then we can see a kind of end of the week dollar weakness down towards, I would say around about 11,850, 11,860 on the US dollar index, on the FXEM dollar index, and then a rally from there. So as we said, that dollar weakness definitely potentially on the cards. And if we go to the euro, you can see that potential move, which would take us probably up towards kind of 119. And when we zoom out, interesting to see that 119 becomes a head and shoulders with a retest of the neckline before an acceleration to the downside from there. So definitely a potential move on the cards there, and we'll be watching for that. Potential trade to the upside if it does give us entry. Otherwise, we're just waiting for that rally, and then we're going to be selling that area at 119 moving forward. Pound US dollar showing a very similar price action, where on the lower time frames you can see a little bit of a potential move down towards 135, choppy move over the next few days, then acceleration up to 138, and then that becomes a really good sell zone, coming out of a pretty decent corrective structure and a higher time frame structure that is even better looking for continuation to the downside. So a big move in the dollar coming following this corrective move, and then again you kind of get that head and shoulders type structure that's formed here. A little bit of a right shoulder, complex right shoulder potentially that's forming, and then we would see a move to the downside from there. Aussie dollar, US dollar, a little bit confusing. Structurally speaking, we've done everything we need to accelerate to the downside, but we're just getting really holed up in this region. So a couple of things, possibly we see a move back up to retest these highs at 75, which means our C wave just becomes a little bit more complex, a little bit more drawn out, although it's very deep, a very deep move off the highs to say that wasn't the end of the C wave. So we just have to wait for clarity there. In the lower time frames, kind of just seeing a strong Aussie without much in terms of structure, potentially an A, B, C, D, E, expanding triangle in here somewhere, but we just have to be patient with it and see what develops throughout the week. But New Zealand dollar, US dollar on the other hand, still looks really good for a move down. We've got a nice big ABC. We've got a very nice move off the highs of the C wave. Very unlikely that we see a rally up to retest the highs here. It's more inclined to hover around this region. as a corrective move on the lower time frames and then accelerate down from there. So New Zealand dollar to us is confirming that the Aussie dollar shouldn't go too much further from here before turning around, and this may develop into something more complex. So we just need to be patient with it. US dollar CAD, let's go to the 4-hour. You can see we're just sitting with this big corrective move here. Very, very choppy, very, very messy, potentially a kind of A, B, C, D, E expanding triangle in here as well, but too early to speculate what it is and how it's going to end up playing out. All we know is higher time frames. We have a very, very good looking structure, very, very complete looking structure, and should see the US dollar rally from here once these lower time frame structures kind of arrange themselves into something clearer. US dollar Swiss kind of lines in up towards a little bit of US dollar weakness today or this week as we move down towards 91 and then push higher up towards 95. So as you can see, it's kind of alluding to the same as what we're seeing in the euro and the pound, where initially we have a little bit of pound weakness and then a strong rally in the US dollar to follow that. Although the US dollar Swiss actually has another pullback in the cards later on, but that seems to be kind of separate from the euro, US dollar, and the pound dollar moves. So just have to wait and see how this is going to develop. It's also possible this is an A, B, C, D, E triangle that's developing here and not the complex flat that we're seeing. So just waiting to see kind of on the sidelines what exactly the US dollar is forming in some of these pairs. US dollar yen rallying strongly, getting a nice move up towards 113. We believe this move is going to take us up towards around about 118, 117, somewhere in that region, and then a turn to the downside from there, and then a pretty strong move in the yen moving forward. So I think this is short-term yen weakness that turns into a longer-term yen strength as we go risk off in the global markets and the global economy. And I believe a lot of funds flowing back into the Japan, which will strengthen the yen pretty significantly. That's what I'm seeing on the charts, but we'll get to that when the time is right and when the times come. Silver, another one that still has a potential move, a little bit of a pop higher up towards kind of 26 on the higher time frames. It does suit the structure, it does look good, gives us that weak or that dollar strength. The dollar weakness, early on. As you can see, we have a trade running at the moment, decently in profit, stop loss at break even. So potentially just going to take a break even there and then look to re-enter at around about this 25 region to the downside. Also possible that this isn't going to occur and our lower time frame structure actually becomes more dominant and we start to see some downside already, where we have this ABC corrective structure that's played out here. And may start to see further downside moving forward. So just waiting to see what develops here. As you can see, it's pretty much a week of patience and waiting for clarity. What we do have clarity on is that if we get new lows on the silver trade, we go and break these lows that we just saw at 21.30, volume-wise, there's not much underneath it. So you could see a little bit of a vacuum in here, and you just see a big, big drop down towards kind of 18, where you see your first little bit of support. So potentially a really, really big black hole underneath these lows, heading down towards kind of 18 before there's any support, and then underneath that there's even more, and that's why we believe this trade is going sub 10, and why we like our silver shorts. Gold doesn't really correspond to what we're seeing in silver, so that's why I'm kind of wary that the silver rally up to 26 might not occur. We're just seeing how gold could just be chopping around here, and we might actually see some more downside in gold moving forward. So just waiting to see. As I said, clarity is key here. Copper, I still think it's a triangle. I still think we're going to break lower from here, but triangle is very, very speculative, very, very difficult. Entry order below the lows to short copper, definitely valid, and we might start to see an acceleration off this trend line from this region here, and that kind of lines up with platinum as well, where platinum is coming out of a nice big corrective structure that has everything we need it to have, and there's potentially a big move coming out of that to the downside. So this actually becomes a pretty interesting sell zone on platinum, but we're waiting for lower time frame confirmation. We'll be covering this trade with our members as the week progresses. Euro New Zealand, heading away from the dollar stuff. Still a good trade. We still like the structure. When we zoom out to, say, the dailies, we still believe there's a move down towards 155 on the cards, which gives us a pretty decent trade from this region. Then we go into the lower time frames. You can see how we've had a nice impulse off the highs. We've gone into some form of corrective move here. Still looking at it as a bit of an expanding triangle, which could accelerate to the downside. And then we're going to the even lower time frames on the hourly. We're seeing that this corrective structure definitely lining up for a short-term rally followed by a big fall to the downside, lining up with the higher time frames. If that is the case, we want to see this move up towards kind of 165. Then we can keep this entry order below these lows, track our stop towards those highs, and we can probably narrow down the risk reward that we're seeing on this trade down towards kind of 5, 6 to 1, depending on this final move higher. So traders or members, we'll be watching that this week as well. This potentially, it started off as like a 2.5 to 1 trade as our entry order was below these lows. But given the structures that we're seeing on the lower time frames, it's allowing us to choke this in, narrow this down, and it gives us a potential of a 6 to 1 trade to the downside in the euro, which looks really, really good to me. Euro Swiss, I'm going to leave this out, just watching for some things to develop there. Euro Pound has accelerated really strongly off our highs. We said the sell zone at 86.50 to kind of 87. And as you can see, we just touched on the sell zone and just went straight down from there. So we just have to wait and see if there's going to be an opportunity here. So far, it doesn't look like it. Kind of looks like a blow off, and we should get down to 83, where we can start to look for the longer term long trade in the Euro Pound, as the higher time frame structure kind of fills itself out into an ABCDE triangle, expanding triangle, with a move back up to the highs at 98 on the card next. So interesting trade, just waiting to see what develops there. Euro Yen bouncing as well, but kind of in line with the Euro Swiss. There's two opportunities here for the Euro Yen. Potentially it's coming out of a very nice big ABC corrective structure, or it's just a corrective move for a big move to the downside to follow the Euro Swiss. We're kind of on the cards, on the fence with this one. We have to wait and see what's developing here. So again, it's a game of patience. Pound Oz, a nice little setup potentially on Pound Oz as we look at it. There's a nice ABC corrective structure potentially forming here on the lower time frames, and that gives us entry at around about the 189 handle to the downside, which becomes a very, very good trade on the higher time frames. When you look at the higher time frame structures, they still look really good for a move down to these lows at 153. So some big moves potentially in the pound moving forward. Pound's not looking good. And we're seeing the same thing in pound New Zealand. Bit of a more interesting structure, but still to me looks good for downside. Pound Swiss, another one that still looks good for downside, entry order below these lows. Covered this pretty well with our members, but again, going zoomed out, structurally speaking, nice big ABC corrective structure. Might see a rally up to 135 first, but it looks like we've done enough. And when we look at the pound yen is definitely done enough. The structure is complete. We were looking for the sell from here, and the structure itself is now setting up really nicely out of this ABC corrective structure for a move down. So we'll be looking for entry here as well. Members will be watching that. Aussie dollar yen, gone really risk off, but structurally speaking, there's not much here. We have to just wait and see if this is going to be a meaningful move to the upside, or it's just a zigzag, some kind of potential triangle forming in here, and we see a turn to the downside. So have to wait and see what's going to develop here moving forward, and just patiently waiting. But when you look at New Zealand dollar yen, again, New Zealand dollar yen more confirming of the structure, where we get a nice ABC correction and a potential big move off the highs. We're still trying to pick a top here. Again, we get that head and shoulders type structure that's formed. We're still trying to pick a top because the higher time frame structures are indicating this is a turning point, and a big turning point at that, where we could see very, very strong moves in the yen, especially against these commodity currencies like Aussie dollar yen, New Zealand dollar yen, and CAD yen. And again, we look at the CAD yen, we're seeing the same thing. Just a structure that's really looking for a big move to the downside. We just have to be patient with it and see if we can get a good sell in this region. We're trying to pick a top at the moment. Sometimes that's difficult, and as we can see, that's what we're getting now. But it looks to me like this could be a blow off top, the final move higher, which turns around once we make new highs. Then we can start to look for that short entry. So still not interested in the long. I'm looking for the shorts and just waiting patiently for that to develop. Swiss yen, pretty much the same thing. I'm not going to get into too much detail there. UK oil, our oil long, still performing well. We've read the oil chart really well this year, all the way back to 2020. We were getting long in this region here. We closed a nice long with some pullbacks in this region. Now we're in our second long oil, potentially getting up to $100, but I'm really wary of this. Our stop loss is at break even because this could potentially turn on a dime to the downside. So very, very wary of it, but so far it's looking really, really good. Maybe later in the week we'll be managing the stop, trailing the stop a little bit higher to lock in some profits. The only reason I'm worried is if we look at natural gas, you can see structurally speaking, we've got a nice big ABC corrective structure that's formed here. And when we zoom in, you can see quite a strong move off the highs. That is potentially a turning point and a move to the downside, which could be negative for oil as the energy crisis kind of comes to more of a balanced outlook. But it's also possible that this is just an ABC for further upside, in which case we'll get another leg higher in natural gas, which will be very, very strong for oil. So we're just watching the structures developing on the lower time frames to see what's there. We long oil, but we do have an entry order that is at zero, so we're at break even, no risk on the table. NASDAQ, ABC corrective structure potentially forming here, and this is just something of a concern because if we get a move off the highs, ABC correction, we could see another move to the downside, which is basically, if we start to fall from here, another 5% off those highs, and maybe even beyond that. But it's very, very wary. It's a very, very wary level here where we could just see risk off in the US markets, and that's obviously going to have implications to everything here. But there's still that potential for one more leg higher in the NASDAQ before we see that turn. But structurally speaking, it looks a lot like we could see a leg down from here moving forward. EM, just moving to emerging markets real quick. Structurally speaking, we still think higher time frames very, very bearish. As you guys know, we've been discussing this for a while. I think this has got to do with the Chinese developments, what's happening in China, deflationary shock. And then we go to the lower time frames, all the way down to the hourly. We can see we're developing a little bit of a continuation pattern to go and make new lows on EM, which goes a long way to confirm what we're seeing is a very, very bearish setup for emerging markets. Hong Kong is already showing that, already broken down, already showing that downside, and still quite a bit of downside to come on the higher time frames. And then the stock exchange of Thailand also looks really bearish on the higher time frames, just waiting to clarify what's happening in this region here. We might see this as a little bit of A, B, C, D, E, and we see a little bit of a wave failure with this acceleration or this latest impulse to the upside. And if that does fail before it makes new highs, that is a very, very bearish move to the downside to come. And then the Kospi, the South Korean composite index, breaking an important trend line on the lower time frames, and higher time frames looking equally bearish. And we're seeing the same thing in the Nikkei, which is here. We're seeing a very, very strong turn to the downside. If you look through the higher time frames, the last 2 weeks, very, very bearish, and structurally speaking, a potentially bigger move to the downside moving forward. So watching that as well. And then US dollar ZAR getting a bit of a bid this morning, showing that these emerging market currencies still look pretty weak here, getting a bit of a bounce off this lower time frame corrective structure, and that should continue to move forward in terms of US dollar strength. So as you can see, that US dollar strength maybe just be tied to the developed markets and not so much into emerging markets, because Brazilian real still looks good for a rally continuation. The ruble, which is supported by oil, sitting in a very, very, very key area here. We could start to see a bounce in the US dollar against the ruble. Turkey continues to look weak. The Korean won continues to look weak. So you can just see how these emerging markets look to be really, really struggling. It could be part of the contagion that we're seeing out of the China property bubble coming to a close and a swift turnaround. Moving on to crypto, finally. Bitcoin, I'm not so sold here. There's a lot of stuff going on which I'm not liking. I think we might see further downside. I'm still in the weak camp here, but there's still a potential for a potential bounce here. So structurally speaking, if we get a move down towards this trend line of 55,000, that becomes a potential buy, and a move up to kind of 63, between 60 and 63, somewhere in there. I'm really, really cautious. That's a lower time frame move. The higher time frames still not showing much in terms of potential further upside or further clues as to where we're going. So I'm on the fence waiting for something that says, yes, that is a definite buy. We want to be in it. Ethereum still has a bearish outlook to me until we break these 4,000 highs. So we just have to be patient with that and wait for some clarity. It's cool, guys. As you can see, it's a big kind of wait and see moment right now. We're waiting for some direction in the markets, waiting for these structures to confirm themselves and give us more clarity. But generally speaking, we think that there's a possibility we're going to see some dollar weakness early in the week, maybe into next week, and then from there we'll start to see that dollar bull market really take off to the upside, and we'll see that deflationary shock really start to unwind into the markets. That's what we're seeing in the charts. That may be not even coming to pass. This may be not coming to pass. We may just be seeing upside here. So we'll just have to wait for clues as to what we're seeing, and if we are going to get any better clues for just a continuation of that dollar bull market. So it's either dollar bull market later on or dollar bull market now. We're just waiting for the clues there. It's cool, guys. Members, we'll see you in the members area to confirm those trades and the levels we're looking at. And the rest of you, we'll see you next week for next week's game plan. Have a great one.